Welcome back to Crime Time Inc.
Sometimes the cases we cover are just difficult to even comprehend, and
Right.
and today's story is certainly one of those.
Absolutely. The 2014 Peshawar school massacre
Yeah.
is just a horrific event that shook the world. I mean, I remember when this story broke, it was impossible to process.
It really was. December 16th, 2014,
Mm-hmm.
the Army Public School in Peshawar, Pakistan,
Right.
was attacked by 6 heavily armed gunmen. And these
Wow.
weren't just random actors. They were affiliated with the
Yes.
Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, or TTP.
So right from the start, we're dealing with a planned attack,
Absolutely.
not some spontaneous act of violence.
Right.
What was their objective?
It wasn't a hostage situation.
Mm-hmm.
The TTP's goal was chillingly straightforward:
Uh-huh.
to inflict as many casualties as possible.
Wow.
They entered the school grounds by scaling the walls
Right.
and made their way to the auditorium, where a large assembly of students were gathered for what was supposed to be a first aid training session.
It's hard to even imagine the terror those students must have felt when those gunmen burst in.
Yeah, it's just unimaginable, the chaos. The
Horrible.
terrorists opened fire indiscriminately.
Wow.
On the students and staff, it was a bloodbath.
Oh, my God.
149 people were killed that day, 132 of them school children between the ages of 8 and 18.
Oh, wow.
Even the principal, Tahira Kazi, was tragically burned to death in front of her students.
It's gut-wrenching knowing those details.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about the TTP and their motive for such a horrific attack?
Well, the TTP claimed responsibility for the attack almost immediately.
Hmm.
Their stated motive was retaliation for the Pakistani military's offensive against them in North Waziristan, known as Operation Zarb-e-Azd, which had been launched earlier that year.
So the TTP saw this attack on a school filled with children as some sort of revenge against the military.
Tragically, yes. The TTP's statement specifically framed the massacre as payback for the military targeting their families.
Wow.
They even tried to draw a parallel between their actions and the casualties inflicted by the Pakistani military.
But how could anyone justify murdering innocent children, no matter what the perceived grievance?
It's a question that haunts anyone who looks into this case.
Yeah.
It speaks to a level of depravity and disregard for human life that's hard to fathom.
Right.
This wasn't just about sending a message. It was about inflicting pain and terror on the most vulnerable members of society.
This level of planning and coordination suggests there was a mastermind behind the attack.
Right.
Was anyone specifically identified as the one who orchestrated this horror?
Initially, a TTP leader named Umar Mansour claimed responsibility in a video released shortly after the attack.
Okay.
However, Pakistani government officials later stated that the actual planner was a man named Saddam Yan,
Okay.
who was working under instructions from both Mansour and another high-ranking leader, Maulana Fazlullah.
So a more complex chain of command than initially thought. What happened to Jan?
He met a swift end.
Okay.
Pakistani Special Forces, the SSG commandos,
Right.
were on the scene at the school quickly, engaging the terrorists and ultimately killing all 6 of them during a rescue operation.
Wow.
They managed to rescue 960 individuals.
That's amazing.
But of course, the damage was already done.
Yeah.
In the weeks following the massacre, Jan was killed in a raid by Pakistani Special Forces.
So there was at least some semblance of swift justice for the victims and their families.
Yeah, I think there was a sense of urgency
Right.
on the part of the Pakistani government to apprehend those responsible.
It's clear this event resonated far beyond Pakistan's borders.
Yeah.
How did it specifically impact Pakistan's policies and its relationship with the world?
The Peshawar massacre forced Pakistan to confront the issue of terrorism head-on. It led to significant policy changes, including the lifting of the moratorium on the death penalty for terrorism-related cases and a dramatic escalation of military operations against the TTP.
Wow.
Public opinion, which had previously been somewhat divided on the issue of militancy, turned sharply against the TTP in the wake of this attack.
So it sounds like this horrific act became a turning point for Pakistan in its fight against terrorism.
It absolutely did. And it highlighted the devastating consequences of unchecked extremism and the need for a unified global response to combat it.
It's a terrifying reminder that the fight against terrorism is a global one, requiring cooperation and a shared commitment to protecting innocent lives.
Precisely. And within Pakistan itself, this attack led to the creation of a comprehensive strategy to combat terrorism, the National Action Plan.
Go ahead.
This 20-point plan aimed to address everything from military operations to cracking down on hate speech and reforming the education system. It was a recognition that defeating terrorism required more than just military might. It required tackling the roots of extremism.
Wow, that's a very ambitious plan.
Absolutely.
And we'll have to dig into that more after the break.
Definitely. The National Action Plan was certainly ambitious, aiming to hit the problem from multiple angles.
So a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
Can you break down some of the key aspects of this plan for our listeners?
On the military front, it meant intensifying the already ongoing operation in North Waziristan.
Right.
And expanding those operations into other areas where militant groups were active.
So a much more aggressive stance against the TTP and other groups operating within Pakistan's borders.
Precisely. The plan went beyond just military action, though.
Okay.
It also included measures to cut off terrorist financing, regulate religious seminaries that were seen as potential breeding grounds for extremism,
Right.
and a major push to counter extremist ideology through media campaigns and educational reforms.
It sounds like they were trying to get to the root causes of extremism, not just treat the symptoms. Was this effective?
It's a complex picture. There were undeniable successes.
Okay.
In the years immediately following the plan's implementation, Pakistan saw a significant decrease in the number of terrorist attacks.
Right.
Security forces made progress in dismantling militant networks.
Yeah.
And there was a greater focus on intelligence-led operations rather than just reactive responses.
So at least in terms of reducing the frequency and severity of attacks, the National Action Plan seems to have had a tangible impact.
Yes, but it wasn't a cure-all.
Sure.
There were downsides and unintended consequences.
Right.
The crackdown on militant groups, while necessary, sometimes led to indiscriminate arrests and extrajudicial killings.
Right.
And the regulation of religious seminaries, while aimed at curbing extremist teachings, was seen by some as an infringement on religious freedom. It's a difficult balance to strike.
It sounds like the fight against terrorism, even when motivated by the best intentions, can raise some serious ethical dilemmas.
Absolutely. And the National Action Plan's focus on countering extremist ideology through media and education wasn't without its critics. Some argued that these efforts could be used to stifle dissent and restrict freedom of speech more broadly. There's always the risk of government overreach in these situations.
It's a classic dilemma in counterterrorism efforts, balancing security with civil liberties. It seems like a tightrope walk.
It is. And then there's the perennial issue of implementation.
Right.
A plan is only as good as its execution.
Of course.
The National Action Plan required a massive amount of coordination across various government agencies.
Yeah.
This often led to bureaucratic hurdles and a lack of resources allocated effectively.
So even with a good plan on paper, the reality on the ground could be a lot messier.
That's often the case with these large-scale initiatives.
Yeah.
But despite its shortcomings, the National Action Plan did mark a significant shift in Pakistan's approach to combating terrorism.
Okay.
It demonstrated a commitment to addressing the problem more comprehensively and strategically.
It's a reminder that there are rarely easy answers when it comes to terrorism.
Yeah.
It's a complex issue with deep roots and no quick fixes.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that the choices made in the name of security, even with the best intentions, can have long-lasting and sometimes unforeseen consequences.
We've been talking a lot about the policy changes and the bigger picture, but let's not forget the human cost of this tragedy.
Yeah.
What happened to the survivors of the Peshawar school massacre? How did they cope with the trauma?
The trauma inflicted on those who lived through that day is unimaginable.
Yeah.
Many children witnessed the deaths of their classmates and teachers, experiencing a level of violence no child should ever be exposed to.
It's just heartbreaking to think about. What kind of psychological impact did this have on them?
The emotional and psychological wounds run deep. Many survivors experienced PTSD, anxiety, depression, nightmares, flashbacks.
Wow.
Some struggled with survivors' guilt, questioning why they were spared while their friends weren't.
It's an unimaginable burden for anyone to carry, let alone children.
And it wasn't just the survivors who suffered. Their families were also deeply affected. They went through the agonizing pain of losing a child, often in a brutal and senseless way.
Right.
There was grief, anger, a desperate search for answers for justice.
Were there any efforts made to help these survivors and families heal, to rebuild their lives?
Thankfully, yes. The Pakistani government, along with various NGOs and international organizations, provided psychological counseling and support services. They recognized the long-term needs of those affected by this trauma.
That's crucial.
Right.
What about the school itself? Did it reopen after the attack?
It did. The Army Public School reopened, albeit with heightened security measures. This was a powerful statement, a refusal to let terror win, a symbol of resilience in the face of unspeakable tragedy.
It must have been incredibly difficult for the students and staff to return to that place.
It was, and it remains a challenging process. The healing is ongoing. The trauma of that day continues to cast a shadow over the lives of the survivors and their families.
Right.
The scars may never fully fade, but there's a determination to move forward.
It's a testament to the strength of the human spirit. But what about the question of justice? Were those responsible for this horrific act held accountable?
Yes, there were efforts to bring the perpetrators to justice.
Right.
As we mentioned, the Mastermind, Saddam Yan, was killed in a raid.
Right.
But others were involved in the planning and execution of the attack. Several individuals were arrested and tried in Pakistani courts.
What were the outcomes of these trials?
Some of those involved were sentenced to death, while others received lengthy prison terms.
Okay.
But securing convictions in terrorism cases is notoriously difficult. Evidence can be hard to come by. Witnesses are often intimidated or fear retaliation.
Right.
And the legal process itself can be complex and lengthy.
So even in the face of such a horrific crime, the pursuit of justice was an uphill battle.
It was. And while some measure of accountability was achieved, there are still questions about whether true justice has been served. Many families of the victims feel that all those responsible haven't been fully held to account, particularly those higher up in the TTP's chain of command.
I can imagine there are lingering frustrations for the families, a sense that true closure is elusive.
Absolutely. They want to see everyone who played a role in this massacre, from the planners to the gunmen, face the full force of the law. And perhaps even more importantly, they want to ensure that no other family has to endure the pain they've experienced.
Right.
They want to see lasting change.
I understand that some of the families have become quite vocal in their demands for justice and in their efforts to push for change.
You're right. In the years since the attack, some of the families of the victims have become powerful advocates for peace and education.
Wow.
They've channeled their grief and anger into a force for positive change, speaking out against extremism and calling for greater understanding and tolerance.
It's inspiring to see them turning such a horrific tragedy into a call for action.
They've formed organizations, held rallies, and even challenged the government on its counterterrorism policies. They've become a voice for peace in a country that has often been torn by conflict. Their courage and resilience are truly remarkable.
It speaks to the enduring strength of the human spirit, the capacity to find hope even in the darkest of times.
Exactly. And their stories remind us that the consequences of terrorism extend far beyond the immediate casualties.
Yeah.
They ripple outward, affecting entire communities, generations, and the very fabric of society.
Right.
But they also remind us that even amidst such tragedy, there's a possibility for healing, growth, and a brighter future.
We've covered a lot of ground in discussing the Peshawar school massacre.
We have.
We've looked at the attack itself, the perpetrators, the motive, and the immediate response. We've delved into the broader impacts,
Right.
the National Action Plan, the geopolitical consequences, and a long road to healing for the survivors and their families.
Right.
But there's one more aspect of this story I'd like to explore. The story of Ehsan.
Ah, yes. Ehsan, the former spokesperson for the TTP. A fascinating and controversial figure.
What can you tell us about him and his role in this larger narrative?
Ehsan was a key figure in the TTP for many years. He was their public face, the one who claimed responsibility for numerous attacks, including the attempted assassination of Malala Yousafzai, which, as you know, garnered international attention.
His name certainly rings a bell. What happened to him?
In a surprising turn of events, Ehsan surrendered to Pakistani authorities in 2017. This was a major development at the time. He had been a high-value target, and his surrender was seen as a potential intelligence coup.
I bet. Did he provide any valuable information to the authorities?
He did. Ehsan's confession provided significant insights into the TTP's inner workings, their funding sources, their recruitment tactics, and their links to other militant groups, both within Pakistan and internationally. His cooperation was seen as a blow to the organization, potentially disrupting their operations and shedding light on their network.
So what happened to Ehsan after he surrendered? Was he put on trial?
That's where things get a little murky. In 2020, Ehsan claimed to have escaped from Pakistani custody. He released an audio message accusing the Pakistani intelligence agencies of mistreating him and vowing to expose their secrets.
That's a pretty bold move. Did they ever recapture him?
His whereabouts remain unknown to this day. Some reports suggest he fled to Turkey.
Okay.
But Pakistani authorities haven't officially confirmed this. His escape raised serious questions about security lapses and the government's handling of high-profile detainees.
It adds another layer of intrigue to this already complex story.
It does. Ehsan's story, much like the Peshawar attack itself, highlights the ongoing challenges Pakistan faces in its fight against terrorism. There are internal divisions, external pressures, and the constant struggle to balance security measures with human rights considerations.
It's a stark reminder that the events of that December day in 2014 continue to reverberate, casting a long shadow over Pakistan's present and future.
Absolutely. And it underscores the need for continued vigilance and a commitment to addressing the root causes of extremism if we hope to prevent such tragedies from happening again.
It's clear this wasn't just a domestic issue for Pakistan.
Right.
As we've discussed, the Peshawar attack had ripple effects across the globe.
Absolutely.
How did it reshape Pakistan's relationship with the international community, particularly in the context of counterterrorism efforts?
Well, the Peshawar attack put a spotlight on the issue of cross-border terrorism.
Right.
Remember, the TTP, while operating within Pakistan, was known to have ties to groups in Afghanistan.
Right.
This inevitably strained relations between the two countries. After the massacre, Pakistan's army chief at the time, General Raheel Sharif, flew to Kabul to meet with Afghan officials.
Okay.
There was a clear message.
Yeah.
Pakistan demanded action against TTP sanctuaries in Afghanistan.
So this attack ratcheted up the pressure on Afghanistan to address the presence of these militant groups within its borders.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Afghan government, under pressure from both Pakistan and the international community, assured Pakistan that they would take action against the TTP.
Okay.
There were even discussions about joint operations between the two countries to target these groups.
Yeah.
But the reality on the ground was far more complicated.
What kind of complications arose?
Well, the border region between Pakistan and Afghanistan is notoriously porous and difficult to control.
Right.
There are also a multitude of actors with competing interests in the region, making it difficult to forge a unified strategy. The Afghan government itself faced challenges in terms of capacity and resources, and there were concerns about potential blowback from other militant groups if they were to crack down too heavily on the TTP.
So a lot of moving pieces and a lot of potential for things to go wrong.
Exactly. The Peshawar attack highlighted not just the problem of terrorism itself, but also the complexities of international cooperation in dealing with such a transnational threat. It underscored the need for countries to work together, to share intelligence and to coordinate their efforts if they truly want to combat terrorism effectively.
We've talked a lot about the policies, the geopolitical fallout, the legal battles, but I want to circle back to the human element of this story.
Yeah.
What about the long-term impact on the survivors, the families, the community? How does a society even begin to heal after such a horrific event?
The healing process is ongoing. It's a long and arduous journey for those who were directly impacted. Many of the children who survived the attack still carry the trauma of that day with them.
Of course.
They struggle with anxiety, depression, nightmares, flashbacks. Some have physical injuries that serve as constant reminders of what they endured.
I imagine it's not just the physical and emotional scars, but also the social and economic consequences for these families.
You're right. Many families lost their primary breadwinners in the attack. There are children who were orphaned, their lives upended in an instant. There are also broader societal impacts. This event shook the community to its core, creating a climate of fear and mistrust. It impacted the education system, with many parents hesitant to send their children to school for fear of another attack.
It's heartbreaking to think about the ripple effects, the way this one event continues to cast such a long shadow.
It does. But amidst the pain and suffering, there are also stories of resilience, of communities coming together to support one another, of individuals finding ways to rebuild their lives. There are organizations dedicated to providing counseling and support services to survivors and their families. There are educational initiatives aimed at promoting tolerance and understanding, at countering the narratives of hate that fuel extremism.
It sounds like a long and difficult road ahead, but one that's paved with hope and a commitment to creating a better future.
It is, and I think it's important to remember that the story of the Peshawar school massacre isn't just a story of tragedy and loss, but also a story of human strength, courage, and the enduring power of hope. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's a capacity for healing, growth, and a belief in a brighter tomorrow.
This A shocking case for Simon and Tom to talk about in their weekly review on Sunday. But in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.